Hi, this is James, and I'm here in part 4 of our 6-part video series where I'm sharing my Lenormand card meanings. If you stuck with me this far, then you know we're now halfway through the deck. So in previous videos, we've gone from card 1, which is rider, up to card 18, which is dog. So in this video, we're going to be looking at cards 19 through 24. So we're going to be looking at tower up to heart in the deck. And if you're just joining me, I'd like to give you a little bit of a recap. This video series was inspired by a couple of my viewers, Miss L and Carla, who each asked me if I would be willing to do a video, or in my case, because I'm terribly wordy, video series where I'm sharing my personal meanings for the cards when I work with them. So I want to thank them both for the inspiration, and I want to continually thank each and every one of you who has watched every single installment of the video series. I do appreciate it. I appreciate all the views, the likes, the comments. I'm really enjoying having a dialogue with each and every one of you. So now that I've said that, I always like to also introduce a deck that's going to be walking with us through this journey. So once again, we're going to be working with La Faneuse, Lilac Dondorf, and just as I have for every part up till now, I will leave a link to the information about the deck in the description box below in case you would like to learn more about it and maybe add it to your own personal Lenormand collection. So now that I've introduced the deck, let's get to the table and take a look at the cards for this video, starting with Tower. Alright, and here we are with card 19 in the deck, which is Tower. And so my first go-to keyword associations for Tower are company, corporation, institution, and a firm. And then following that, my next keyword associations are separation, isolation, being alone, or lonely. When it comes to Tower, I also think of rules and regulations and policy and procedures. I also think of things like elevation. And so that could be elevation of status. And then it would go into hierarchy, again, going with the same kind of theme, elevation of status. And when it comes to work, I tend to look at Tower as a card of freelance work. Now, if you go with the idea of being isolated and being alone and being separated, it could also be, like Fox, a card of self-employment. But with that, I would see that more because of the Tower being so large in size. It could be like some sort of expansion with your self-employment venture. Like, you know, it goes from, like, let's say with Fox, it becomes more of an organization. Like you may have started out as a one-person or one-man operation going with Fox, because Fox represents independence and doing something independently. But now it's gotten to the point it's grown in size, and so now it becomes more of a company, corporation, a firm. But it started as a self-employment venture. And keeping with the very literal aspect of Lenormand, Tower can represent a tall building or a high rise. For me, I tend to look at Tower as things having to do with the law or legal matters. Now, keeping it relative to Lenormand, Tower can also be something that represents tradition, right? If you're going with the idea of, like, are you going to be a traditional reader of Lenormand, or are you going to venture outside of that? But I tend to look at this as tradition. And then for me, this is very personal. I've had this happen in my life with Tower. This card can represent something having to do with the state, something on a state level, something having to do with government, or something of a political nature. So if you go with the idea of an institution and something having to do with government, then you might think of like the IRS. If this was in combination with fish, which is money, but we'll talk about that one later. And then the last couple of keywords I have for Tower or office, if you go with the idea of like a high rise or a tall building and you think of like office space. But then playing on that, something being made official. So if you're talking about a rule or regulation or a policy and procedure, then this card would suggest it's becoming official. So those are my keyword associations for tower. And so now we'll move on to the next card in the deck, which is garden. And now here we are with card 20, which is garden. So when garden comes up, my first immediate keyword associations are a community or a group. This card can represent something public or something social. It can represent events or venues. And going with the venue aspect, this card can represent public and or social gathering places. Keeping with the very literal aspect of Lenormand, this could represent the outdoors. It could represent nature. It can represent actual parks. Going with the social aspect of the card, I tend to look at this as social media. And that would be really key if birds was next to this card. Going with the idea that I talked about birds being tweeting and Twitter. And now this is one of my personal associations for garden. And this represents every single person who's watching this video, which is audience. Right? And so going with the idea of groups of people, garden for me can represent society and the world at large. And then here's an interesting one that I got from someone else. He refers to garden as angels. And I like that one. So sometimes if I'm doing a very spiritual reading, I tend to look at this card as angels. So those are my keyword associations for garden. And now we're going to move on to the next card in the deck, which is mountain. And now we're at card 21 in the line, which is mountain. So my first go-to keywords for mountain are challenge, block, and obstacle. I also think of things like a delay, a setback, or a postponement with this card. This card for me personally can represent like procrastination, like on days where, I have a lot to do or I set myself up to do something. I have found that when this card is in my line, something happens and it doesn't get done. And sometimes it's because I'm a procrastinator and I waited till the last minute to do it. So there's that procrastination. Keeping with the very literal aspect of Lenormand, this card can actually represent the mountains. And playing off on that idea, somewhere that's distant or remote. And then my last keywords for mountain are boundaries or borders. Now this card, if you go with the idea of the expression about having a mountain to climb, this card can show up when the challenge is there, but it's not insurmountable. You can overcome it, it's just a matter of time. So those are my associations with mountain. And now we'll move on to the next card in the line, which is Crossroads. And now we are at card 22 in the deck, which is Crossroads. One of my personal favorite cards. I love this card. So for me, when Crossroads comes up, it represents choices, alternatives, and options. Those are my first keyword associations with Crossroads. It can represent a decision that needs to be made. Going with the literal aspect of Lenormand, it can represent an actual path, a road, an intersection, or a trail. I tend to look at this card as an approach card, like we're approaching something, or our approach to something. It can also represent a route, going with the travel aspect, a route that you're going to take, or some kind of avenue. I sometimes see this card as diversification. For me, Crossroads represents multiples. So when this card comes up as a descriptor of something, it could represent multiples, suggesting that there's more than one. And then my final thought about Crossroads, it can represent, being at a crossroads in life, and you're considering what direction to move into next. It's kind of a thing like, where do we go from here kind of thing. So those are my thoughts on Crossroads, and now we'll move on to the next card in the line, which is mice. And here we are at card 23, which is mice. So for me, I first think of, with mice, I think of stress, worry, and loss. Mice can represent something that's eating away at you or gnawing at you. And going with the idea of loss, this is a card that can represent theft. And for me, going with the idea of something eating away at you or gnawing at you, mice can represent a gradual decline or a gradual decrease. It could represent erosion and some form of decay, meaning like something that's deteriorating. Right, and going with the more literal aspects of Lenormand, this card can represent pests and vermin, but it can also represent any kind of nuisance. And then my last associations with mice, going with the idea of loss, this card can represent something that's being lessened or something that's being diminished. And so those are my thoughts on mice. And now we'll move on to the next card in the line, and the final card for this installment of this series, which is heart. All right, and here we are with card 24, which is heart, and it's going to serve as the last card in this video installment. And so for me, heart, when it comes up, the natural go-to associations are love and romance. But keeping it relative, if I'm doing a reading for myself, I am not in a relationship, and I usually don't explore love and romance. So for me, my immediate go-to keywords are passion, enthusiasm, and desire. Heart, it can also be a card of infatuation. But really at the gist of it, heart is really a card about our feelings, our emotions, and it can also be a card of affection. Now going with the literal aspect of heart, heart can actually represent an actual heart, the organ, the heart, so it can represent that. Now, I've said this before, this is one of my personal associations. Going with garden, where I talked about garden can represent an audience, right? This card, heart, for me can represent a fan or a follower. And going with that, because you have fans and followers typically on social media, right? And YouTube is a form of social media. Then heart can represent a like on social media. You know, in these days now, they have it where the like can actually be a heart shape symbol. So there's that. And going along those lines, heart can represent an emoticon. And now I want to just mention that here we have a playing card insert, and here we have the Jack of Hearts. So heart can also be a person. So that will bring this installment in my video series on my Lenormand card meanings to a close. And in the next installment, we'll be looking at cards 25 to 30, and card 25 is ring, and card 30 is lily, so we'll be looking at ring to lilies. So we did it. Now we've moved from the halfway mark, and we're now get 1 or 2 videos closer to wrapping up this series. So I look forward to having you join me for the next video installment, and until that time, I'm wishing you a wonderful day and take care.